The Secret Diaries, Chapter 5. The Secret to Money. The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. If Chapter 4 made me look at my emotions, Chapter 5 made me pause in a very different way, not because of something complicated, but because of something surprisingly simple. Money. Not how to make it, not strategies or tips, but something much quieter, almost invisible at first. Because before anything else, this chapter made me ask myself a question I didn't expect. What do I actually feel when I think about money? And I didn't answer immediately. I noticed. Is it calm? Is it tension? Is it confidence? Or a subtle kind of pressure I've just gotten used to? Then another question came up. Do I feel like there's enough? Or am I constantly preparing for not enough? And that one stayed with me a bit longer, because it's easy to say what we want, but this chapter gently points somewhere else, somewhere more honest.
What is my default reaction when money shows up in my thoughts? Do I welcome it, or do I tighten up? Do I trust it comes, or do I feel like I have to chase it? I didn't expect these questions to feel so personal, but they do. And maybe the most uncomfortable one was this. If nothing changed externally, would I still be able to feel okay about it? And the more I sat with it, the more I realized this isn't just about money. It's about something deeper that most of us rarely stop to examine. So before going into what the chapter actually says, maybe just sit with this for a moment. What story have you been telling yourself about money without even realizing it? So let's go deeper into Chapter 5 and explore what it's really about. The uncomfortable truth about money. Money is a result. This hit me more than I expected, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that quiet, uncomfortable way that stays with you long after you've read it. Because if I'm being honest, I've always treated money like the goal, something to chase, something to fix things, something that would eventually make everything feel settled. You know that feeling. Once I have enough, then I'll relax. But reading this made me pause, because if money is a result, then it's not the thing you chase, it's the thing that shows up after. It's the outcome of something deeper, something less visible. And suddenly the whole perspective shifts. Now the question isn't, how do I get more money? It becomes, what is money actually a result of in my life? And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because it means money reflects your thinking, your habits, your decisions, the way you respond to opportunities, the way you deal with fear, risk, or even success. It reflects how you manage what you already have and how you feel about having more. It's almost like money is constantly giving you feedback, whether you want to hear it or not. And the more I sat with that idea, the more I started connecting it to my own life, not in theory, but in everyday moments. Thinking about bills, planning ahead, wanting stability, that quiet pressure to have things under control. Money isn't just practical, it's emotional. Sometimes it's a sense of safety. Other times it's stress in the background that never fully switches off. And that's when the questions started to feel more real. Do I actually feel in control of my money, or am I just reacting to it? When I check my finances, do I feel calm or slightly tense without even realizing it? Am I constantly trying to catch up, like money is always just a step ahead of me? Or am I building something where money comes as a natural outcome? Because if I'm honest, there have been moments where it felt like chasing, like no matter how much I did, it never quite felt like enough. And according to the book, that's not random. It comes from something deeper, what it calls your money blueprint.
the set of beliefs and patterns you've built over time, often without even noticing. Things you picked up growing up, things you saw, things you repeated, quiet assumptions about what money means, how hard it should be to earn, or whether it's even something you're allowed to have in abundance. Most of us focus all our energy on the result, on earning more, fixing numbers, trying harder, while completely ignoring the internal patterns that are actually creating that result. So we end up trying to change the outcome without changing the source. And that's why it often feels like running in circles, because if money really is a result, then working harder on the surface won't fully change things unless something deeper shifts underneath. And that's the part that's not always easy to face, because it means looking inward at your habits, your reactions, your beliefs, the way you think when no one's watching. So if money is a result, then the real question isn't just how to get more of it. It's this: what am I doing consistently, internally and externally, that's creating the results I currently have? And once you start asking that, you can't really unsee it. The feeling of having. Like attracts like. The first time I really paused on that line, it almost slipped past me. It sounded simple. Too simple, honestly. The kind of phrase you hear so often, it starts to lose weight. But something about it lingered, so I stayed with it a little longer than usual, and slowly it began to shift. I realized it wasn't talking about effort, not in the way I had always approached things. It wasn't about doing more, pushing harder, or figuring out the perfect strategy. It was pointing somewhere quieter, toward alignment. Because if money is a result, and if like attracts like, then the question changes, almost without you noticing. It stops being, what do I need to do to get money? And becomes, what do I need to feel to be in alignment with it? That question landed differently. It wasn't as comfortable. There's something exposed about it, because it moves the focus inward to a place that's harder to measure, harder to control, and harder to fake. Because it means you can't just think a few positive thoughts about money and expect something to shift. You can't override everything with a quick burst of optimism and call it alignment. It goes deeper than that. It's about the dominant feeling you carry, the one that's there by default, the one that shows up automatically, without effort or intention. So I got curious, not when I was actively trying to think positively, but in the in-between moments, the ordinary ones that usually go unnoticed. When I saw a price that felt higher than expected, when I paid for something small, when my mind drifted toward future expenses. I started paying attention to what happened in those moments, and what I noticed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming or loud. It was subtle. A small contraction, a brief hesitation, a quiet thought that would pass almost instantly. I need to be careful. That was it. Nothing extreme, nothing that would raise alarm, but it was consistent. And that consistency started to feel important, because this chapter suggests something that's easy to overlook. It is impossible to feel bad and at the same time have good thoughts. If that's true, then it reframes everything. It means it's not just about what you say you want, not even about what you consciously believe for a few moments at a time. It's about what you consistently feel, the baseline. So if the underlying feeling around money is tension or worry or a quiet sense of lack, then that's the signal being sent out over and over again. And over time, that signal becomes familiar, and what's familiar tends to repeat. That idea stayed with me longer than I expected, because it shifts the work entirely. It's no longer just external, strategies, actions, plans. It becomes emotional, internal, subtle. It becomes about learning how to feel as if things are already stable, already okay, already enough. Not in a way that denies reality, not pretending everything is perfect, but gently shifting the internal state, even if just a little. From pressure to calm, from scarcity to possibility, from not enough to it's working out. And the truth is, that shift doesn't happen overnight. It's not a dramatic transformation where everything suddenly clicks into place. It's quieter than that, slower. It shows up in small decisions, like noticing the first flicker of stress and choosing not to follow it immediately, or catching a thought and softening it instead of letting it spiral, or simply pausing long enough to feel something different, even if it's only for a moment. Those moments don't seem significant at first. They're easy to dismiss. But maybe that's where the real practice is. Not in forcing yourself into big, convincing beliefs, but in becoming aware, genuinely aware of the feeling you carry through your days. And then, little by little, allowing it to shift. Because if like attracts like, then even the smallest change in that feeling isn't small at all. Receiving without resistance. You have to feel good about money to attract it. At first, that line almost felt like a conclusion, like something you arrive at after understanding everything else. Simple, clear, and easy to agree with on the surface. Of course feeling good would matter. Of course your emotional state would play a role. But the longer I stayed with it, the more it started to feel less like a final answer and more like a doorway into something that's much harder to notice in real time. Because it's one thing to say you feel good about money when you're thinking about it intentionally, when you're reflecting, journaling, or trying to align with the idea. But it's something else entirely to notice how you respond in the quieter, unguarded moments, the ones that don't feel important enough to examine, the ones where your reactions are immediate, almost automatic, and therefore more honest than anything you consciously tried to construct. And that's where the question subtly shifts again, not toward what you want, not even toward what you believe, but toward what you allow. Because wanting money isn't the same as being open to receiving it, and that distinction is easy to overlook, precisely because it doesn't announce itself in obvious ways. It hides in habits of thought that feel reasonable, even responsible, patterns you've likely repeated so many times they've become indistinguishable from common sense. It shows up in the quiet calculations you make without realizing, in the instinct to hold back just in case. In the subtle tightening that appears when something feels uncertain or temporary. None of it dramatic, none of it extreme, but consistent. And that consistency starts to carry weight, especially when you begin to see it not as isolated thoughts, but as a steady background signal, one that quietly defines your relationship with money over time. Because if money is approached with a sense of caution that borders on tension, or with an underlying expectation that it can disappear as easily as it arrives, then even moments of gain can feel fragile, temporary, almost provisional. And that's where something interesting begins to emerge from this chapter's perspective. It's not suggesting that external circumstances don't matter. It's not asking you to ignore reality or pretend stability where there isn't any, but it does point to something that operates alongside those circumstances, something less visible, but no less influential. The way you receive, not just physically, but emotionally. Because receiving, in this sense, isn't a passive act. It isn't just about something arriving in your life. It's about whether it's met with openness or with resistance, whether it's allowed to settle or quietly questioned the moment it appears. And that questioning can be incredibly subtle. It doesn't always sound like doubt. Sometimes it sounds like preparation, like being careful, like staying grounded. But underneath that, there can be a hesitation to fully experience something as stable or sufficient, as if doing so would somehow make you vulnerable. So even when something positive happens, an unexpected opportunity, a small financial win, even just a moment of ease, there can be a tendency to immediately balance it with caution, to dilute it just slightly before it has a chance to fully land.
Almost as if fully receiving it would be too much. And that pattern, once you start to notice it, is difficult to unsee because it reframes the entire idea of attraction in a way that feels less about effort and more about permission, less about trying to bring something in and more about recognizing the ways it might already be kept at a distance, not consciously, but habitually. And that's where this part becomes less theoretical and more observational. Because instead of asking, how do I get more money? It begins to ask, how do I respond when something is already here? Do I relax into it? Or do I brace for it to change? Do I acknowledge it fully? Or do I immediately move past it as if it doesn't quite count? Those questions don't demand immediate answers, but they do create awareness. And that awareness starts to reveal patterns that were always there, just operating quietly in the background. For me, it wasn't a single realization. It was a series of small recognitions, each one almost easy to dismiss on its own. A moment of hesitation here, a fleeting doubt there, a tendency to downplay something positive before it had time to feel real. Individually, they didn't seem significant, but together, they formed something consistent. A kind of emotional rhythm. And if that rhythm leans more toward caution than openness, more toward questioning than allowing, then it starts to shape the overall experience in a way that feels familiar, even predictable. Which brings the focus back to something surprisingly simple, but not necessarily easy. What would it mean to receive something fully, even briefly, without interrupting it, not exaggerating it, not forcing it to mean more than it does, but also not diminishing it before it has a chance to settle, just letting it be enough, as it is, for a moment longer than usual. Because maybe that's where the shift begins, not in dramatic changes or constant positivity, but in those small, almost invisible moments where the usual pattern softens, where the instinct to question or contract is noticed, but not immediately followed. And in that space, however brief, something else becomes possible, a different relationship, not with money itself necessarily, but with the experience of receiving it. The discipline of attention. One of the most important secrets is simply to pay attention to your thoughts. At first, that line doesn't sound like much. It almost feels too ordinary to matter, like something you've already heard in a dozen different forms. Pay attention, be mindful, stay aware. But the more I sat with it, the more it stopped sounding like advice and started feeling like a description of something that's already happening all the time, whether you notice it or not. Because attention isn't something you occasionally use, it's something you're constantly spending. Every second of the day, it's moving somewhere. To a thought, a memory, a worry, a plan. And what surprised me most wasn't how much I was thinking, but how quickly I was leaving one thought for another without even realizing I had done it. It's almost like the mind has its own rhythm, its own habit of movement. One moment there's a sense of possibility, something light, open, maybe even calm. And then, without any clear transition, another thought slips in, quieter than a decision, more like a reflex. You should be careful. What if it doesn't work? That's probably not realistic. And just like that, the tone shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way you can easily point to, but enough that the feeling changes direction. What stayed with me wasn't the content of those thoughts. It was how normal they felt,
How reasonable, almost responsible, as if questioning things constantly was the same as being grounded in reality. But the chapter gently challenges that assumption, not in a forceful way, but in a way that makes you start observing your own mental movement a little more closely. Because if every thought creates a feeling, even briefly, then the speed at which you move from one thought to another actually matters more than it first appears. There's a moment most people don't notice, the instant after a new thought appears, but before you fully attach to it. It's extremely short, almost invisible. And most of the time, you don't pause there. You just continue, as if the thought automatically deserves your full attention. But when you do notice it, something subtle becomes visible. You can feel how quickly a different emotional direction starts to form, how a single thought can slightly tilt your internal state before you've even consciously agreed with it. And then the next one comes, and the next. It's not chaos, it's consistency, just not in one direction long enough to settle. That's where this idea begins to feel less like theory and more like something you can actually observe in real time. Not trying to stop thoughts, not trying to control them, but noticing how easily you move away from one feeling before it has a chance to fully form. And sometimes, in those moments of noticing, there's a small shift. Not dramatic, not permanent, but noticeable. A kind of pause where you don't immediately follow the next thought, where you let the previous one linger just a second longer than usual. It might be something simple, a feeling of possibility, a sense of ease, even something very small, almost neutral. But instead of replacing it right away, you stay with it just a little longer. And that's where something interesting starts to happen, because the mind, left alone for even a few extra seconds in one direction, begins to deepen whatever it's focused on. The feeling becomes clearer, less fragmented, more stable, not because you forced it, but because you didn't interrupt it so quickly. And over time, that changes something subtle in how you experience your day. You start noticing that not every thought needs to be followed immediately, that not every suggestion the mind offers has to become your current reality. Some thoughts can simply pass through without becoming the next emotional state you live in. It doesn't create silence, it doesn't create perfection, but it creates space. And in that space, there's a different kind of stability, one that isn't built on controlling what you think, but on recognizing that you don't have to move with every thought you have. Gratitude and the absence of lack. Be grateful for what you have now. By the time this idea appears, it almost feels like something you've already processed, something familiar enough that your mind is tempted to move past it without really stopping. Gratitude doesn't sound new. It doesn't challenge you in the same way as the earlier ideas about alignment or receiving. If anything, it risks sounding like a conclusion that's too neat, too simplified compared to everything that came before. But when you don't rush past it, when you let it sit for a moment, it begins to unfold differently. Because placed at the end of the chapter, it doesn't function as a surface-level suggestion. It starts to feel more like a quiet correction, a redirection of attention that addresses something you may not have fully noticed until now. The habit of absence. Not in an obvious or dramatic sense, but in the way attention subtly gravitates toward what isn't there yet, what hasn't arrived, what still feels incomplete. It's a habit that doesn't announce itself as negativity. Most of the time, it feels practical, forward-looking, even necessary. You think about what needs to be improved, what needs to be secured, what still isn't enough. And without realizing it, that orientation becomes constant, not overwhelming, not urgent, but steady, a kind of low-level scanning for what's missing, repeated so often it begins to feel like the natural way of engaging with reality. So when gratitude is introduced here, it doesn't interrupt that pattern in a forceful way. It doesn't demand that you suddenly see everything as perfect or complete. Instead, it offers something much quieter and in some ways more difficult, the possibility of noticing what is already working without immediately moving past it. And that turns out to be less simple than it sounds, because the mind doesn't naturally linger there. Even when something goes well, even when there's a moment of ease or sufficiency, there's often a quick transition, almost automatic, back to what's next, what's uncertain, what still needs attention.
The moment registers, but it doesn't stay. It's acknowledged and then quietly replaced. So gratitude in this context begins to feel less like a feeling you generate and more like a moment you extend, a decision, subtle, almost invisible, to remain with something supportive just a little longer than you usually would, to let it land fully. And in doing that, something starts to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that immediately changes external circumstances, but internally in the tone of experience. Because when attention lingers on what is already stable, already sufficient, even in small ways, it interrupts that continuous pull toward lack. Not by denying it, not by arguing against it, but by giving equal, if not greater, weight to something else. And over time, that balance begins to change. What once felt dominant, the sense of not yet, not enough, almost there, starts to lose some of its intensity, not because it disappears, but because it's no longer the only thing being reinforced. And that's where this idea connects back to everything else in the chapter, because the feeling of having that seemed so abstract at the beginning, the ability to receive without resistance, the awareness of the story you keep repeating, all of it becomes more accessible when the baseline shifts, even slightly, away from absence and toward recognition. Not forced, not exaggerated, but real. And there's something else that becomes clear in that process, something easy to miss if you only think of gratitude as a technique. When it's genuine, it doesn't feel like effort. It doesn't feel like you're trying to convince yourself of something that isn't true. It feels more like remembering something you overlooked, a quiet realization that in between all the movement toward what's next, there are already points of support, of stability, of enoughness, however small, that you've been stepping over without fully seeing. And once you begin to notice them, even briefly, they start to accumulate, not in a way that overwhelms you, but in a way that gradually changes the atmosphere of your thinking. The urgency softens, the constant reaching eases, and in that space, something else becomes possible. Not a sudden transformation, not a complete shift in reality, but a different starting point, a different emotional ground from which everything else unfolds. And maybe that's why this idea is left until the end, because after all the complexity, after examining thoughts, feelings, resistance, patterns, it comes back to something that doesn't require force or control, just attention, directed differently, held a little longer, until what once felt secondary begins to feel just as real as everything that was missing. Bringing it into daily life. See yourself living in abundance, and you will attract it. By the time this idea appears, the chapter has already moved through a full internal journey. Thoughts, feelings, resistance, attention, gratitude. So when it arrives here, it doesn't feel like a new concept anymore. It feels more like a test. Not in an intellectual sense, but in a very practical one. What happens when you try to live this instead of just understand it? Because it's one thing to follow the logic of the ideas while reading them. It's something else entirely to notice how they show up, or don't show up, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. When you're paying bills, buying groceries, checking your balance without thinking, or reacting to a sudden unexpected expense. That's where everything quietly reveals itself. And so the practical part of this chapter isn't really about doing something new. It's about observing what is already happening and then very gently interrupting it. Not forcing positivity, not pretending life is different, but noticing the automatic patterns
and in small ways, choosing not to follow them all the way through. A thought appears, I need to be careful. And instead of immediately building a story around it, you see it for what it is, a habit, a reflex, something that has been repeated so many times it feels like truth.
That's the beginning of the practice. Not control, not denial, just space. And in that space, something else can briefly appear, a different interpretation, a different emotional tone, even if it's very subtle, a sense of this is manageable, or this is not as urgent as it feels, or simply a pause where nothing escalates. It doesn't change your reality immediately, but it changes the way you stand inside it. And over time, those small internal shifts begin to accumulate. Not dramatically, but consistently enough that your reactions stop being identical. Less automatic tightening, less immediate assumption of lack, more moments where things are simply experienced without the usual emotional contraction. That's where the idea of living as if slowly becomes less abstract, not as pretending, but as familiarity building, allowing the mind to experience, in small doses, a version of emotional reality that is not dominated by tension or scarcity. And that is where Elena's story begins. Elena didn't change her life because of one decision. She changed it because of a moment she almost ignored. She was 33, living in a small seaside town where everything felt close, familiar, and slightly repetitive in a way she had stopped questioning. Her job at a local administrative office wasn't bad. It was stable enough, predictable enough, and just enough to keep life moving forward. But forward had started to feel more like repetition than direction. Money wasn't something chaotic in her life. It was something managed, carefully, quietly, constantly in the background. There were no crises, but there was always calculation, always awareness, always a kind of subtle tightening when she thought ahead too far. When she first picked up The Secret, she didn't expect much. It was one of those books she had seen mentioned online more than once, always with mixed reactions. Some people called it life-changing, others called it unrealistic. She wasn't looking for either extreme. She was just curious enough to read a few pages. She almost stopped halfway through chapter 5. It felt too simple at first, this idea that money responds to feeling, that attention and emotional state matter, that lack itself becomes a kind of signal. It sounded interesting, but also far removed from the kind of financial reality she lived in, where things were decided by numbers, timing, and practical limitations. But she didn't close the book. Instead, something in that chapter stayed with her. Not the big ideas, but the smaller observations. The suggestion that most of her reactions to money weren't neutral, that they carried feeling, subtle tension, habitual concern, automatic tightening she had never really questioned. She didn't try to change anything immediately. That wasn't her way. But she started noticing. At first, it was almost uncomfortable how often it appeared. Every time she opened her banking app, there was a brief moment of anticipation. Not excitement, but a kind of low-level brace, as if she was preparing for information rather than simply receiving it. Every time she paid for something, even something small, there was a flicker of internal adjustment. Okay, less now. Every time she thought about the future, there was a quiet layering of what-ifs that felt responsible, but slightly heavy. She didn't judge it. She just saw it. And that alone started to change something, because once she noticed it, she couldn't fully unsee it anymore. One evening, months later, something very ordinary happened. She was sitting at her kitchen table after work, phone in hand, about to check her account. It was a routine she had done hundreds of times without thinking.
there was always that same micro moment before she pressed the button, a subtle tightening, almost invisible, as if preparing herself for whatever the number might confirm. But this time she paused, not dramatically, not intentionally at first, just a small interruption in the habit. And in that pause, something different appeared. Not a belief, not a conviction, just a question that felt quieter than her usual thoughts. What would this feel like if it didn't create tension? She didn't try to answer it intellectually. Instead, she let herself imagine for a few seconds what it would be like to look at the number without that internal reaction. Not a fantasy version of wealth, not an exaggerated shift in life, just the absence of that familiar contraction. Then she checked. The number was exactly what it had been. Her situation was exactly the same, but her reaction wasn't. Not completely. There was still awareness, still reality, but less emotional tightening around it. She didn't think much of it at the time. It felt too small to matter, but she started doing it again, not as a practice she labeled, but as something she occasionally remembered in real life. When she paid for groceries, when she looked at upcoming expenses, when she felt that familiar instinct to mentally calculate everything ahead of time. Sometimes she still reacted exactly as before, but sometimes, just sometimes, there was a gap, a small one, where she didn't fully enter the old pattern. And over months, those gaps began to change how she made decisions. She stopped immediately dismissing ideas that involved more income because they felt slightly uncertain. She started applying for small freelance work on the side, not because she suddenly believed everything would work out, but because the resistance wasn't as strong as it used to be. She asked questions she normally wouldn't have asked. She said yes to opportunities she would previously have talked herself out of before even trying. Her life didn't transform overnight. There was no sudden shift in income, no dramatic turning point, but something quieter was happening underneath it all. The emotional baseline she was operating from was no longer identical every day. Less automatic fear, less constant contraction, more moments where things simply felt open enough to try. And years later, when she thought back to that chapter, she didn't describe it as something that changed her life instantly. She described it as something that changed how she met her life. "I didn't start by believing differently," she once said. "I just stopped reacting the same way every time. And somehow that changed everything slowly, without me noticing when it actually began." And maybe that's where the chapter quietly ends, not with a promise of instant transformation, but with a suggestion that life doesn't always change because everything outside shifts at once, but because the way you move through it, moment by moment, stops being exactly the same.
What this chapter is really pointing to. By the end of this chapter, the idea of money no longer feels purely external. It doesn't feel like something that exists only in numbers, strategies, or outcomes. It starts to feel more relational. Something shaped not just by what you do, but by how you think, how you feel, and how consistently you return to those patterns without even noticing. And when you look back at everything this chapter explored, the feeling of having, the ability to receive, the awareness of your thoughts, the discipline of attention, the quiet shift into gratitude, it all seems to point in one direction. Not toward chasing money differently, but toward experiencing it differently first. Because maybe the real shift doesn't begin when something changes in your bank account. Maybe it begins in those small, almost invisible moments where your usual reaction softens, where you don't immediately fall into tension, lack, or assumption, where you pause, where you notice, where you choose, even briefly, something different. And those moments don't look important. They don't feel like breakthroughs, but they accumulate, quietly, until the way you relate to money is no longer built on the same automatic patterns. Not perfect, not constant, but different enough to create a new starting point. And from that place, everything else begins to shift. Not all at once,
but in ways that feel more natural than forced. So maybe the question this chapter leaves you with isn't, how do I get more money? But something much quieter and much more powerful. What is my default feeling when it comes to money? And am I willing to become aware of it? If this made you stop and reflect even for a moment, I'd really like to hear from you. What's one small reaction you've noticed in yourself when it comes to money? Something you've never questioned before? Drop it in the comments. And if you want to explore more chapters like this in a deeper, more real way, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.